Today I'm going to be telling you 3 spooky stories. The catch is, each story will be a different Game Boy game. And in case you're wondering what this whole getup is, it's almost Halloween, everyone's going to be dressing up as their favorite characters. I figure I would dress up as my favorite spooky YouTubers. So if you're a fan of retro video games with a focus on the Nintendo Game Boy, well, you've come to the right place because that's pretty much all I talk about. And with that out of the way, on to the stories. Revenge from beyond the grave. A boy and his girlfriend are happily walking down the street together when they suddenly encounter something truly horrifying. Without warning, they are suddenly attacked by a group of strange men, who grab the girl and attempt to carry her away. When the boy tries to save his girlfriend, one of the men pulls out a gun and fires, sadly ending the young man's life. The girl's father, who happens to be a paranormal scientist, resurrects the boy's spirit and explains that the boy can now use his, ghostly energy to possess the bodies of any living creature, gaining their powers in the process. The boy unfortunately cannot save himself, but by stealing the bodies of his enemies, he now has a chance to save his girlfriend. This is the premise of Avenging Spirit, which originally appeared in arcades in 1991. And even though this game would have fit perfectly into the Super Nintendo library, the only other system it appeared on was the Nintendo Game Boy. Avenging Spirit has since been released on a variety of platforms, from the iPhone to the PS5, but every version available commercially today is just a re-release of one of the 2 versions available from 1992. When I first started collecting for the Game Boy, it was right around the time when old guard YouTube retro video game channels like Metal Jesus Rocks and Pat the NES Punk were beginning to talk about hidden gems. Even though the NES was the main system everyone was really excited for at that time, all the systems from the past were being plundered for forgotten treasures from our childhood, and Avenging Spirit was the hot Game Boy game that almost everyone was talking about, which was likely because it had recently been released on the 3DS's Virtual Console. Unfortunately for me, the fact that everyone was talking about it also meant that if I wanted to buy an original copy of the game, it commanded a price that was about 4 or 5 times what most other Game Boy games were going for. Even though I originally started collecting in the summer of 2011, it wasn't until March of 2014 that I finally found Avenging Spirit for a price that I was willing to pay, $19.49, which is an absolute steal by today's standards, but this was only kind of a good deal back then. So with all that being said, does Avenging Spirit live up to the hype? Or is it all just an elaborate hoax? You decide. It's alright. Now, just to address the pink blob in the room, Avenging Spirit definitely isn't the only game starring a cute ghost character in which the main gameplay hook is to steal powers from various enemies running around the stages. Kirby definitely does this mechanic better. But I'll remind you that Avenging Spirit originally came out in 1991. Whereas Kirby didn't get his signature copy ability until Kirby's Adventure, which came out in 1993. Unlike Kirby, the ghost in Avenging Spirit is completely helpless on his own. His spirit energy is represented by this giant bar at the bottom of the screen. The smaller bar below it is the life meter of whatever body you are currently inhabiting. Taking damage will drain both meters simultaneously, but if the body you're currently inhabiting is killed, your spirit will be released and your energy will drain quickly until you find another body to possess. If your energy drains completely, you will no longer have the strength to remain here on Earth and you go to heaven. Which sounds nice, but you don't have time for that right now. You have to find your girlfriend. Every enemy in the game is a potential character for you to control, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Some are good at running and jumping but have very weak offense and defense, while others are slow but tanky and powerful. Some enemies only use physical attacks like punching and kicking. Others use guns or bombs. There's a genie who can only attack with a tiny little punch, but he can float in the air and fly through the stages. There's a missile shooting robot and a vampire that throws bats. There's a lot of variety here, and every new enemy you see is an opportunity to play as a new character. Avenging Spirit hangs its hat on this one gimmick, which is admittedly pretty unique and innovative, especially for its time. Unfortunately, the rest of the game ends up being just a plain vanilla platformer, which is likely a result of the developers designing the game to be completed by any one of a large assortment of playable characters. Once the novelty of this gimmick fades away, or conversely, if you weren't especially sold on it in the first place, there's nothing here that you haven't seen done better in countless other platforming games. Despite the volume of playable characters in the game, it's not going to take you too long to discover that only a handful of them are really worth hanging on to. And every other character in the game is basically just a body you get stuck with when a good character dies. And the game seems to be fully aware that once you find a character you like, you aren't really going to want to switch to anyone else. So it strong arms you into engaging with the body swapping mechanic by swarming you with a constant onslaught of aggressive enemies that make it unreasonably difficult to hang on to any one character for very long. At the same time, it gives you unlimited continues, so it's not a difficult game to finish on your first attempt, but it does get pretty frustrating. In order to see the true ending to the game, you have to find 3 keys that are hidden throughout the game, which will allow you to unlock the room where your girlfriend is being held captive. If you don't have all 3 keys by the end of the 6th and final stage, you could still beat the game, but you'll get the sad ending. This gives Avenging Spirit a bit of replay value, because you aren't guaranteed to find all 3 keys on your first playthrough. I think I like the idea of Avenging Spirit more than the game itself. It's a cute and unique game that is certainly worth a playthrough, but it's not quite as well executed as other games with a similar gameplay hook. And I certainly don't think it's worth the prices that even a loose copy is going for these days, so I definitely recommend one of the more cost-effective methods that are available to us today. If you grew up in the 80s, you were likely aware of 3 formative movie series which were at least tangentially related to the horror genre. I'm speaking, of course, of Aliens, Predator, and Terminator. If you were a fan of any of these series, the early 90s were an exciting time. In late 1990, we got Predator 2. In the summer of 1991, we got Terminator 2. And finally, leading into the summer of 1992, we got Alien 3. Following the action-heavy focus of James Cameron's Aliens, Alien 3 was possibly attempting to call back to the looming horror of the original Alien, in which the protagonists of the film were threatened by a single creature. However, it would appear that the true monster of Alien 3 was the movie itself. The meddling production company 20th Century Fox allegedly made the film a nightmare to put together, and with a rug-pull plot that killed off all the characters from the previous film, thus trivializing every bit of drama from that movie, Alien 3 was likely doomed to be a disappointment from the start. But you don't have to be a good movie to receive a large number of video game adaptations. Now, the problem with Alien 3, one of its many problems anyway, is that it's extremely difficult to adapt an action game from a movie with very little action and only a single antagonist. So the compromise they made was to use the name and basic aesthetic from Alien 3, but structure the gameplay around aliens, which was far more conducive to a video game adaptation. So in other words, lots of aliens, lots of guns. Now, most versions of Alien 3 are essentially the same, with a very similar game appearing on the Amiga, NES, Genesis, Master System, and Game Gear, and a unique but still comparable game appearing on the Super Nintendo. The only truly unique version was the one developed by Bit Studio for the Game Boy, which is quite possibly the closest the Game Boy has to having its own Resident Evil-style survival horror game. Alien 3 for the Game Boy is a top-down action-adventure game with a heavy emphasis on exploration, item acquisition, and inventory management. Poking around the first area in the game, you'll find your first weapon, which is a cattle prod, as well as the first of the game's many keycards to unlock various locked doors. And finally a map, which is pretty unhelpful from a navigational standpoint, but it still has some useful information that I'll get to later. Pressing select will pull up the inventory screen. You'll see that there are 5 slots for items, 2 of which are now taken up by the first keycard in the map, and there's an additional 5 slots for weapons. From this screen, you can equip a specific item or weapon by pressing B, and pressing A will drop that item from your inventory. You'll pick up many more weapons during the course of the game, as well as the ammunition to use them, but you'll never have to worry about running out of space. However, there are many more items in the game than you can carry at once, so strategic management of your inventory space becomes a major part of the game. As soon as the game begins, the clock starts ticking. You're left to explore in relative safety at first, but at about the 5-minute mark, aliens will start showing up in the main areas in the game. Facehuggers in the medical area, small aliens in the living quarters, and full-grown aliens on the planet's surface. And hopefully by this time you'll have picked up a gun, because the cattle prod is almost useless. Now we can go back to that map screen, and the pertinent information it provides is down here in the left corner. These numbers show the number of aliens currently on the planet: eggs, facehuggers, small aliens, and then large aliens. The object of the game is to completely destroy the alien presence from the ground up. You can shoot aliens and facehuggers all you want, but they will continue to respawn until all the eggs are destroyed. Only after all the eggs are destroyed can you move on to the other areas and exterminate the remaining aliens. Once all the aliens are taken out, the alien queen will appear in the final area, and you'll need to lure her into position to be shoved into the furnace. This number shows how many prisoners are still alive, which isn't terribly important unless you're going for a high score, and this timer shows how long you have until the Weyland-Yutani dropship arrives. If the dropship arrives before the queen is destroyed, the game is over. The alien population will continue to grow as long as there are eggs present, so the faster you destroy all the eggs, the less time you'll have to spend hunting down aliens in the last half of the game. In other words, Alien 3 is perfect for speedrunning. Or at least it would be perfect for speedrunning if it were maybe a little more fun to play. The 4 main areas in the game are separated by ventilation shafts. There aren't any enemies in these areas, but they are filled with fans that, depending on which direction you approach them from, will either blow you down the corridor or vacuum you into them. You'll need to find control panels to either reverse the direction of the fan blades or deactivate them completely, which is a pretty interesting mechanic at first, but given how often you need to move between the game's primary levels, you'll be spending a lot of time going back and forth through these ventilation shafts, and you have to control the fans every single time, which gets tedious pretty quickly. Now, I also have some issues with the hitboxes in the game. It's way too easy to take damage when it doesn't even look like you're touching an enemy, especially the eggs for some reason. But the biggest drag in the game is the constant need to go in and out of your inventory screen to equip one keycard after another. I'm not really a huge fan of required menu navigation in any game. For me, it's a real momentum killer. I think in this case, they should have just made it so just having the keycards in your inventory was enough to open up each of the doors. It's a little obnoxious having to equip each one individually to use them. But all in all, I was pretty impressed with Alien 3. Despite the fact that they clearly took some creative liberties with the story to make it work as a video game, I think the slower paced adventure game direction they took with this version really works well on the Game Boy. And the running clock adds that extra layer of addictiveness and replay value.
I'm back. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
For tonight's final tale, we have a classic superhero origin story, but warped and twisted like the ghoulish reflection of a funhouse mirror in some seedy carnival attraction. This subversion of expectations begs a question. What if the hero of the story was actually the monster? 1990's Darkman might not be a Halloween movie in the traditional sense, but Sam Raimi's aggressively campy visual style and bizarre tonal shifts between tragedy, action, comedy, and horror, accompanied of course by a rousing score from Danny Elfman at the peak of his powers, make Darkman slot very neatly into a distinctive selection of movies that I watched on a repeat when I was a kid. Now, I don't watch it nearly as often as an adult. I typically only put it on maybe once every 2 or 3 years or so, but always around Halloween. There's nothing about Darkman that is overtly Halloween-esque, but it definitely pairs nicely with the season. Darkman was also adapted into a number of video games because, of course it was. Although for the longest time I was only aware of the NES version. I remember reading about this game in Nintendo Power back in the day, but I never actually played it. In fact, everything I know about the Darkman NES game has come directly from a review from GameDave, which is a pretty good video, you should give it a watch. But Darkman also got a game for the Game Boy, which I originally assumed would just be a direct port of the NES game. However, as I'm discovering is often the case when a British developer is at the helm, the Game Boy version is similar to the NES version in name only. Darkman on the Game Boy is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game along the lines of Double Dragon. Granted, it doesn't look quite as good as the Game Boy versions of Double Dragon, the first two at least. Darkman himself is recognizable only if you know what you're looking for. To be honest, if I'd seen this character sprite out of context, I would have assumed it was supposed to be the Invisible Man or maybe Rorschach from The Watchmen. But behind these simplistic character designs and the pokey walk animation, there's a surprising amount of depth to its combat that almost immediately pulled me into the game. In fact, I'd say that this game has the makings of what could possibly be one of the best beat-em-up games on the Game Boy. There's the basic punch and kick, of course, the meat and potatoes of any respectable beat-em-up game. You also have a jump kick, which is a good way to quickly knock down bad guys. And while they're lying prone on the ground, you could do a leaping smash down onto their chest for a massive amount of damage. Once you've stunned a bad guy with enough punches, you can pick them up and carry them around for as long as you want. They don't even struggle, not even after you give them a couple good headbutts. You can toss them into other bad guys to bowl them all over, or if you don't want to deal with any of that, you could just chuck them off a ledge to their death and be done with it. Occasionally you'll encounter enemies with melee weapons like nunchucks or a big stick. You can steal these weapons and use them for yourself. The game is usually nice enough to let you hang on to them for a couple screens before forcing you to drop them. Darkman follows only the most action-heavy portion of the movie, giving a brief, PG-rated synopsis of the inciting incidents of the story before dropping you into the Chinatown sequence that kicks off the final act of the film. After defeating Polly at the end of the first stage, the game moves to Darkman's hideout in the chemical factory, then to the rooftops where he faces Durant on the skid of his helicopter. The final stage is a vertical climb through a construction site, at the end of which there's a final battle with Louis Strack and his improbably oversized rivet gun. Other major characters from the movie show up in the game as recurring enemies, such as Smiley, the long-haired blonde guy, and Skip, the dude with a gun for a leg. Other characters not related to the movie are also prominently featured, like Steven Seagal, Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead, and Tim Pool. Sadly, Bruce Campbell does not make a cameo in the game, which is, unfortunate. It's also worth mentioning that there's a good amount of platforming in the game, much more than you'd expect to find in a typical beat-em-up. For as much time as you'll spend beating up bad guys on the ground, you'll also be climbing up and down ladders and leaping between platforms. And in the final stage, there's a number of chains that you'll use to Tarzan swing over pits. Now, there's a reason why extensive platforming mechanics are not exactly a welcome addition to your average beat-em-up game, and I'm gonna get to that. But I will say, I did appreciate how Darkman used these mechanics to break up the monotony of just walking to the left from one enemy encounter to the next. There's a lot more stage design here than I've seen in any other beat-em-up game I've ever played, which I'm counting as a good thing. What's not so good are the controls, and if you've been listening to me talk about this game so far and thinking that you really want to try it out, it's right about here that you're probably going to change your mind. There is no dedicated punch and kick buttons. The function of the A and B buttons change depending on which way you're facing. If you're attacking an enemy to your right, A is punch and B is the kick. If you're attacking an enemy to the left, it switches. To jump, you have to press A and B at the same time. To jump kick, you have to press A and B followed by whichever button corresponds to the direction you're jumping towards. A if you're jumping to the right and B if you're jumping to the left. In any other game where the functions of the action buttons are consistent, it's easy to enter kind of a zen state, where you no longer even need to think about the controller in your hands. But when the controls are constantly alternating, you can never fully become absorbed into the game. There will always be some level of detachment from the game so you can keep track of what the punch button is at any given time. But there's more! During the platforming sequences, the isometric perspective switches to a strictly 2D view, limiting your movement to left or right. On these 2D platforms, if you press down, you will drop down through the platform. There is no practical application for this mechanic during the entirety of the game, so there's no logical reason why they should allow you to do this, especially when 99% of the 2D platforms in the game are suspended over instant death pits. And I'm telling you right now, if you play this game, you will eventually lose a life because your thumb accidentally grazed the down direction on the D-pad. And lastly, when you exhaust all your lives, it's straight back to the title screen. There are no continues. Darkman is, without a doubt, one of the hardest Game Boy games that I've ever beaten, and this difficulty comes entirely from the clumsy, unreliable, and unintuitive controls. This is extremely unfortunate because otherwise this would have been an easy recommendation to make. When the controls are working, Darkman is legitimately fun. It feels good to beat up bad guys and throw them around the screen. But when the controls are working against you, Darkman becomes an absolute chore to get through.